Welcome to Biblioccultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and I do fiction as well. And sometimes I also do what I call reject shelf reviews, which are basically books that I do not like. But in this episode, I will definitely go to a book that I love, The Black Books by C.G. Jung. But first, please remember to subscribe to my channel, click the bell for notifications if you want to get notified when I put out a new video. Like the video, share the video, and comment on the video if you have something you want to say. Now keep in mind, before I begin, that the book reviews that I do are just that, reviews. A lot of people sometimes look at the book that I'm reviewing, and if they disagree with the author, if they have their own dogmatic beliefs, they get upset because the argument goes against their own particular viewpoint. So that is an issue with the book, and if that is the case, don't read the book. My intent here is to recommend books that I like and that I find are saying something important. And if you disagree with the content, then go in the comment section and recommend books that you think would make a good counter argument to the book that I'm reviewing. So don't shoot the messenger, because this is about books, and I love books of all types, of all kinds, and I review the books in the mood of the book. I'm not here to counter argue every book I review. I am here to tell you what the book is claiming, some general ideas of its content, why I like it, but after that it's up to you to either read it or not, but hopefully you enjoy it one way or the other. So, The Black Books by C.G. Jung, and this edition, which is very, very nice, was published by W.W. Norton and Company in 2020. And as some of you may know, it's a facsimile of the original, and obviously it has a translation, so you can see Jung's handwritten book, and then some of his art, and then the translation in the back end of it, as you're going to see here in the video as I go through all the volumes. Now, I also have the Red Book by Jung, and these books are obviously related, but the Black Books are what Jung called Liber Novus, which is his personal notebook and journal, basically. And he himself says he wanted to know his myth. So the attempt of the book is for Jung to do a journey of self-discovery. So I will call them dialogues with his soul, because he's using art and myth and speculation and fantasy to do a journey of self-development, to do an integration of his self. And since that is Jung's basic philosophy, reading the Black Books will really help you get a more intimate, personal conception of his ideas. So for Jung, this is an issue of the rebirth of God in the soul. So it's all within the framework of his own makeshift internal cosmology. So that's important to understand, because although he does utilize different sources and different ideas from different world mythologies and traditions, he is really very openly trying to generate his own particular private mythos. Because to him, individuation, which is that process of self-discovery, of internal coherency, internal harmony, is in fact a process involving imagination. And to me, that's one of the most impactful aspects of going through these books, is to understand the importance of imagination. A lot of times imagination is left in the realm of fantasy, and even when we were children, a lot of people would say, well, he's in his imagination, but at some point he'll come to reality. There's a prejudice against imagination, which is pretty prevalent in the post-Enlightenment era, and particularly in the scientific era, as people would call it, that anything that is in the mental realm is somehow nonsense or irrelevant. And of course, this is not true. And going through Jung's books will clearly point this out and its impact on our psychology. One point that he makes in the book that I think it's worth mentioning is how he considers it to be difficult to differentiate the mask from the individual self. And when I say the mask, I mean the characters, the personages that we generate out of our own ego, out of our own fears, to present to the world. And these different masks that we use tend to be more a creature of the collective unconscious and not so much of the individual self, but they do merge and confuse each other to the point in which most of us are not able to know the difference. And it's very comforting to know that you also found it difficult, because if a great mind like that finds it difficult, then we shouldn't feel that bad about ourselves. Another aspect that I want to point out is the Atman-Brahman conception that Jung brings up. My impression from studying Sanatana Dharma for many, many years is that Jung seems to be the closest in understanding the very complex inner dynamics of that system, but at the same time, it is pretty clear to me that there are some areas of his thought that seem to be missing important concepts there. Again, I don't blame him for this, because at his time, there weren't really a lot of books that went into the details of the philosophy, theology, and just general speculative conceptions found in the very ancient text of India. A lot of people may not be aware that a lot of these ideas that Jung presents are actually already there, present, and pretty nicely fleshed out for centuries, and I would say millennia. And I have a lot of books on that topic, and I'll eventually do reviews on that as well. So the relationship between the Atman and the Brahman would be a larger totality of existence, and Brahman has a variety of interpretations, because Brahman sometimes would be closer to like a pantheistic model in which all existence is a living, conscious being of some kind, in which we're all reside in and from which we all derive from. And the Atman would be the individual manifestation of this Brahman and how it manifests in the world. And there's a lot of diversity in how these two concepts kind of interrelate, but that doesn't come to the point in this video because I'm sticking to Jung's Black Books. I also find it interesting that he calls all religions as systems for the preparation of death. So very reductive, but very powerfully said, because anything which considers the existence of the soul as a fact is going to obviously ponder on its continuation after the death of the body or the destruction of the body. And obviously all religions contend with this. Even religions that consider themselves to be anti-religions. In the modern world, we have a lot of anti-religion religions, which is oxymoronic to say the least. But even those systems are concerned with death in one way or the other. And also these notebooks, as you go through them, you can clearly see the influence of alchemy and Gnosticism on Jung. Of course, as you read, you realize that he has his own basic interpretations of these things, which is his right to do, because again, these are private notebooks in which he is engaging with his own soul, literally having conversations with the soul. So it is supposed to be a free form dynamic, is not really meant as a work for public consumption. Going into the diary itself, there's a couple entries I would like to discuss real quick. There's a section in the work where he tells his soul that this life is all there is. So it's a very present-minded concept in which he's conversing with the soul, and he tells the soul it is only this world, this life, this one life in which there is any engagement at all. And obviously, although he is influenced by Gnosticism, this kind of life affirmation is not present in traditional Gnosticism, which sees this material world as purely evil and as a prison of souls. Jung obviously is not taking Gnosticism, like I mentioned earlier, fully at its own word. He's combining things and making his own ideas. I want to give a quote. Actually, I have two quotes I want to put, but I'm gonna go through this quote first. Quote, "Gradually it dawned on me that the highest truth is one and the same with the absurd." End of quote. And he actually underlined, highest truth is one and the same with the absurd. So he underlined that, and it's very cool to see it in the notebook underlined so that you can see his own emphasis on that line. Now, obviously, this quote indicates a feeling that a lot of us have felt before. The absurdity of existence sometimes seems to be quite obvious, but also the full-fledged meaningfulness of life is also obvious. So saying that life is absurd in the Jungian parlance just means that there is a dissonance sometimes between our intent, our will, our experience of life, etc. Doesn't necessarily mean that everything is absurd, everything is illogical and chaotic. But that absurdity is present when you have these feelings and experiences. Now, throughout his notebook, as I said, he is mixing ideas, so you will see mentions of Christ, the Virgin Mary, Buddha, Kali, etc. And again, this makes sense considering the fact that he is generating his own mythology. Now, the second quote I want to provide here is also very meaningful. Quote, "It seems to me, though, that one can apply this yardstick even if one is no saint in the sense of the Christian conception. I believe I have learned that no one is allowed to avoid the mysteries of the Christian religion unpunished. I repeat, he whose heart has not been broken over the Lord Jesus Christ drags a pagan around in himself, who holds him back from the best." End of quote. Now, the reason I love that is because his exploration, not only here, but in other of his works, of Christian archetypes are important, because even though he is not a traditional Christian in any sense of the imagination, so I don't find it wrong for non-Christians to use Jung or consider Jung to be one of their own, because I would say pretty clearly he is not what you would call traditional. He's denying a lot of the basic notions of Christian theology, and I would say in many places he would be considered by Christians to be a heretic. Nonetheless, it is also very clear that he is deeply aware of the influence of Christian archetypes in the European mindset, at least in the West, and that he considers it to be so important to preserve in some aspect or other that if we do not, we will suffer dissonance and chaos. And that opinion to me is very interesting. You could disagree with it. It is still very poignant the way he goes about it, because he also goes into the notion of the West and the obsession of the West with words, the impact of words, the manipulation of words, and he drives this idea of words, even the obsession with books itself, as having a source in the Christian development of logos theology. So just having that thought to consider this as a possible genesis of the development of Western civilization makes the book worth it. Just that exploration that you'll go through when you read it. A few more points. His insights on Nietzsche are particularly good. Apparently he was reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra around that time in other of his works, and he comments on this work in his notebook. So just this exploration is also worth reading the book. He also talks about truths not needing to be accepted absolutely. Obviously, this implies subjectivism in his thought. He seems to understand truth as relative or subjective, which is kind of close to the postmodern conception. Again, I'm not saying Jung is a postmodernist. I'm just saying this breakdown of the conception of truth as an absolute is an objective reality. He seems to question it pretty openly, again, in his own personal notebook. He looks at chaos sometimes as a positive thing and considers God to be terrible and not solemn. He actually writes this in his notebook. Let me clarify. When he says terrible, he means impactful, potent, and horrific in the true sense of the term, not in the negative aspect per se, but more in the Mount Sinai, Yahweh has descended upon the mountain, and whoever touches the mountain dies, in that sense. Another aspect that he does explore is the idea of dissolution, that if a soul is not able to develop, to be differentiated in some way, then the soul will be destroyed. Now, this reminded me of a book review I did a few weeks back on the Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey, because Anton LaVey and Michael Aquino's book, which I review, goes into this exploration of the survival of the ego or of the soul or of the personality beyond death. And it is described in almost the same fashion, that if you get differentiated, if you are a strong enough will, then death cannot stop you, you'll continue. And this seems to be Jung's particular viewpoint as well. Again, he didn't invent this. There is a Masonic element to this as well. And lastly, the last thing I'm going to mention from his entries is that he does make a distinction between the I and the self. And I find that peculiar because this is Jung's way of trying to utilize psychological terms to generate an understanding of something that for the ancient people of the world was differentiated by concepts like soul, spirit, body, mind, etc. So there were, even the demon was considered to be an aspect of the personality. So all these components had names. He sometimes uses or reuses these terms, but using a psychological term, just I and self. So he considers the I to be the center of consciousness, but the self to be the totality of the self, of the I. So I found that curious. So in closing, I would say there is a mixed feeling about reading the black books and also the red book of Jung, because it seems pretty clear that he did not intend these books to be read by anyone, or at least not anyone outside of his family. My impression is that these are very personal journals or very personal books of his development, and his family decided to publish them for the world because obviously Jung is an important person in the history of mankind, and therefore there comes a point in which important people like that have influenced so much lose their privacy. So there is something peculiar about reading a private journal of someone whose intention is not to share it, but it is published, it's out there, so you might as well read, learn, and maybe grow out of the experience. So thank you for joining me. Please remember to subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel if you subscribe, if you like the video, if you share the video, and if you comment on the video. I really will appreciate it. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.